later with a former Secret Service colleague of mine describing the danger on the ground and what that could possibly look like. Listen, everyone has an opinion about this horrific Russian invasion of Ukraine. We're approaching the 2-week mark of fighting. But despite all the press conferences, the tweets, the official statements, the debates, votes, and opinions, there are still a lot of very serious open questions about how Vladimir Putin can keep his war machine supplied and funded. I mean, the fight can't go on indefinitely. So what's Putin's plan here? Question one here. First, the level of engagement by the Russian Air Force has been surprisingly minimal. Thank the Lord, by the way, and I'm not using his name in vain there. Military analysts are puzzled by Putin's failure to use all of his air assets to create his desired dystopia and hellscape on the ground in Ukraine. Why is that? Well, I'll have an expert on this coming up in a few minutes. Second, is Putin being strategic here and calculating with his ground forces? Also, if he's holding his ground forces back in this convoy, why? Is he bogged down? Did they not prepare? Does he really want to destroy, another question, major cities like Kharkiv and Kiev? Does he want to obliterate Ukraine's major cities and ports while planning to occupy them later? Kind of an asinine goal, right? Can he afford to rebuild them later? The answers to these questions are still unknown, but they have to be asked. And don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be intimidated. You're not a Russian stooge if you ask basic questions here. Ask the questions. We deserve answers too. Another question here. Putin's massive convoy headed towards Kiev. It's stalled. There's a lot of reporting on this, and Russian forces are frustrated due to weather conditions and reported supply problems. In just days, columns of trucks and troops, they're running severely low on gas and food. How does that happen? That's kind of warfare 101, right? If you're going to invade another sovereign country, God forbid, wouldn't it be wise to make sure your troops at least had enough supplies to get there first? Beans and bullets, folks. Beans and bullets. If you don't have those two things and you haven't nailed down your logistics, it's probably not a good idea to invade a foreign country. We'll have a guest coming up on that soon, too. Lastly, forget the Air Force concerns for a second and the lack of supplies for his invading army. If this fight's going to drag on for a long period of time, which appears to be the case thanks to the resilience of the Ukrainian people, then how does Putin expect to keep funding this war? The value of the ruble's trash, it's garbage, it's bottomed out, it's on the brink of collapse. It even hit 100 to 1 in exchange rate with the US dollar at one point. Folks, the sanctions and banking regulations through SWIFT may not bring down Putin for good, but they're certainly contributing to his ongoing financial and economic woes. How's he going to fund this war? And we found out tonight, by the way, MasterCard, Visa, PayPal, all pulling out. Perhaps the most critical question, however, we should be asking is what will a desperate, isolated Vladimir Putin do? Folks, I just want to say again, too, ask questions. We should be asking, okay, and then what? If we establish a no-fly zone, and then what happens? There are consequences to that. When we know the consequences, we all as American citizens and smart people can process them and talk to our lawmakers and make decisions. Us being there and asking the questions, it doesn't make you some stooge of Putin to ask common sense questions like, how do we avoid a possible nuclear war? Those are real questions with real consequences. And one more thing. The reason Putin doesn't have to ask all the time, and then what, is because some of our lawmakers here keep advertising what we're going to do. Sometimes shutting your mouth is a good thing. No one ever got in trouble for not saying anything. You don't have to advertise to the world every single darn clandestine op we're going to be involved in. Joining me now in our panel here is retired Army Brigadier General Peter Zwack and Royal Air Force veteran and former F-22 fighter pilot Dan Robinson. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. General, I'll go to you first. This convoy headed north to south, General, the reporting on this is endless. It has not moved any substantial distance in now over a week. I mean, what kind of invasion is this? What's going on? They're going to be bogged down in the mud soon.
Good evening, Dan. It's a fiasco for the Russians, and they will paint it a lot of different ways. You're exactly right. I mean, this convoy from hell has been on the road now 6 or 7 days. And imagine those young Russian soldiers in there, probably a bunch of them draftees. And oh, by the way, Putin says there are no draftees. If so, it's even a bigger screw up. They're there. They're inching forward or stopped on a road where it's muddy all around. They can't go off-road. They're getting sniped at. The partisans stay behind Ukrainian forces. You've heard they've been even able to muster a couple of airstrikes. It's a fiasco. Terrible planning. A lot of us have looked at the Russians for a long time, and I was in Moscow in 2014 when they made the first invasion. We thought that they would have learned a lot. They did all those exercises in the last 6 months that we've read about. It's a mess. They're unraveling. They're going to sort themselves out. But we're hearing anecdotal reports now that you've got a lot of young Russian soldiers, including officers, saying, we don't want to do this. You lied to us. This is we're fighting fellow Slavs. We've got grandmothers that are in our way. That's not what they expected. So I think right now the Russians have stopped. They are now reorganizing, and it's looking really, really dangerously like they're going to go in old Soviet style, muscular, massive artillery into Kyiv, and it will be a freaking bloodbath. But the Russians in the first week have been astounding in their clumsiness and ineptitude.
Yeah, no doubt. Dan, I'll go to you next, having experience flying F-22s. What is going on with the Russian Air Force here? They've certainly not dominated the skies by any means. I've heard a number of reports that the lack of precision-guided missiles makes them fly low. They don't want to fly low because they're risk-averse. I've heard other stories that they haven't trained flying with large numbers of planes, just in groups of 2, so they're not used to flying these missions. Your professional opinion, having flown F-22s yourself.
Yeah, well, thanks for being here, Dan. I really appreciate it. It is certainly a very curious case of where is the Russian Air Force right now. And I think what we're starting to see is there is a huge gap between the perception and rhetoric of what the Russian Air Force entails and the reality of what we've seen. You know, day one of the war, we saw, the classical case of launchers to take out surface-to-air missiles, runways, and early warning sensors. We'd usually expect to see that followed up with a offensive counter-air campaign with a combination of strike attack aircraft escorted by fighters, and that has not materialized at all. What that has allowed then is the Ukrainian Air Force and individuals on the ground with surface-to-air missiles to sort of act with a large degree of impunity from threat of attack from the Russian Air Force. And you've seen that in the shooting down of Su-27s and a number of Russian attack helicopters. So we're seeing that in abundance now from the Ukrainian Air Force. I would expect the Russian Air Force to start to materialize in the coming days. But as the General pointed out, what we are seeing here is a large degree of ineptitude, and not just from the Air Force, but their ability to operate in conjunction with troops on the ground in the joint environment. And if they're not doing that and they're clumsy about that, then it's going to lead to significant problems as we move forward.
Mr. Robinson, General, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it. Coming up next on Unfiltered, veteran Pete Hegseth. Pete, thanks for your time. Can you give us an update? What's going on with this changing strategy? It appears he's gotten bogged down up north, but I watched this morning on Fox and Friends. You seem to indicate from the east and the south he's doing a lot better.
That's exactly right. I think we have a time-lapse map that's going to show the fact that the initial push, no doubt the main effort, the hope, was they were going to come from the north, and they have been bogged down there. The famous 40-mile convoy is a portion of it. It's not just that. As a result, but it was always a four-pronged approach from the north, the northeast, the east, and the south. It turns out they've made far more advances in the south, which is not advantageous for Vladimir Putin, but may lead to a shift in strategy, and a tragic one, Dan, because what they have an advantage of in the south, and I think the next slide shows, is it's the closest proximity to the nuclear power plants, one of which they've already taken over, another of which they may soon take over, which means they have control over whether the lights are on, the power is on, the water is on, the internet is on, and that leads to the siege mentality. When you watch those timesheets shift map, Stan, it's almost like an anaconda. It's a strangle effect on the country, choking off all of its options except for the West, where they reinforce. And of course, those Stingers and those Javelin missiles have been devastatingly effective. Reports show that, it's one man with a Javelin from 2.5 miles away, fire and forget, can take out a tank and rinse and repeat. And that's very dangerous. South are being targeted. And that leads me to kind of the next phase, which is civilian targeting, Dan. Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, damned if you do, damned if you don't for him, because he knew that he had to ask civilians to be armed. They don't even have enough weapons for all the civilians, but they're providing them. Through the lens of Vladimir Putin's eyes, and again, through his lens, he'll say, well, if you're arming civilians, civilians are targets. And when civilians are armed and there are targets, then civilian buildings are targets. And if the women and children are fleeing, and if they've left behind, then a woman or a child is a human shield to a civilian target, which he will use to attempt to rationalize to the rest of the world why he's hitting civilian targets. And that's a more traditional Russian tactic, Dan, in the South, is bomb and bomb and bomb into submission, level entire cities, try to break the will of the people there, and then not even take them, Dan. They don't want to hold this ground. They want to put enough pressure and inflict enough suffering that Zelensky says, our will is broken. We can't fight any longer. And that seems to be the approach that he's taking. We see it in the South in what he's doing to Mariupol, what he's doing to Kharkiv in the northeast. Kiev is the eventual goal. The question is, how much will he extract? But it's been really, your previous guests were very interesting. I mean, they are not executing the kind of plan they hoped they would have. It appears if they attempt to inflict more suffering, they think that will bring them to their end goal, which only leads to more tragedy. But it's been amazing to see the Ukrainians fight.
Yeah, those guests were fascinating. Pete, thanks for the update tonight. Thanks for sticking around with us. Coming up. All right, so these are the segments we throw out the prompter, and it's, Dan, audience, kind of candid time, right? I have to be straight with you here. I am stunned we're here right now. Shocked. I am. I'm in a state of shock that just in the last few weeks we're in the position we are now. It reminds me of the first time when I was a police officer, I went out to a crime scene and you see a dead body, you look at it and you think that can't possibly be real. And yet it is real. It's obviously real because you're standing there and your brain is trying to process it and you're saying to yourself, you feel almost like you're living in a movie. This is only, I think, the second time in my life I've had that experience, folks. I can't believe we're staring down, a potential escalation of a war with Russia. God forbid that happens. And what I really can't believe is we have the other side of the political aisle that is really, it's time for them to go and sit down and kind of shut their pie holes for a while. These are the same people who have been anti-national defense, who poked fun at Reagan for strategic missile defense programs, who decided it'd be a good idea to sequester military spending. They thought it'd be a good idea to engage in a Green New Deal and ice out domestic oil production while enriching foreign enemies, spending dollars over there and making them petro-titans. It's hard for me to believe that the same people who recommended that are now the same people who want a seat at the table to tell us what the next options are. You doubt me, by the way, about the Democrats and their insane energy policy? Take a look at this.
Could the president possibly consider authorizing the Keystone Pipeline, working something out with Iran?
Look, the president has said that all options are on the table.
If we do more to invest in clean energy, more to invest in other sources of energy, that's exactly what we can do to prevent this from happening in the future.
As long as we're buying Russian oil, though, aren't we financing the war?
Well, Jackie, again, it's only about 10% of what we're importing. I've not made any announcement about any decision on that front.
There's been a push by some Democrats to ban the import of Russian oil. Where do you stand?
I'm all for that. Ban it.
Here to react is Chris Wright, CEO of Liberty Oilfield Services, and journalist and author Lee Smith. Chris, I'll go to you first. We've engaged in a suicidal national energy policy, which is now impacting our national security for decades, Chris. What would it take now for this country, specifically the left, to wake up and unleash the American energy giant and cut the cord from Russian oil?
A dose of realism. I mean, Alice in Wonderland energy policies have always been impoverishing, destabilizing, and now we see they can be disastrous. So we don't need the government to do a lot except get out of the way. But if the government got out of the way and understood that oil and gas make the world go round, American production could grow, and over the next few years, U.S. American LNG could displace Russian gas. It could certainly happen.
Lee, I want to go to you next. You know, you brought up a great point. I was listening to you on a podcast this week, Lee. I mentioned to you on my radio show as well. You said, you know, with the American left, it's odd. They don't seem to have foreign enemies. They have political enemies. I mean, Lee, the exact same left that celebrated the Soviet Union in the New York Times and the Hillary Clinton reset button people who defended this guy for years, then used him as a tool to attack Donald Trump, and are now telling us now Putin's the enemy, even though they told us he was the good guy, the Soviet Union and Russia forever. It's kind of weird how they keep flipping the script, don't they? Isn't it?
Yeah, well, it gets even worse, Dan, because you know how Pete Buttigieg is saying maybe we'll go to Iranian oil. So, of course, we can't open up, we can't turn on the full energy of American energy production. But instead what they want to do is they want to go to a terror state and rely on energy from a terror state. Here's something a lot of people don't know, that right now in negotiations for the Iranian nuclear bomb, the United States is dealing with the Russians. And that deal is going to be made. What that means is that by striking a deal with Iran, the United States will be legitimizing and legalizing an industrialized nuclear weapons program. In addition, it will provide the Russians with a nuclear client and an arms client. We are enriching the Russians through the Iranian nuclear deal.
Yeah, I agree. It's insane, and I appreciate your inspiration. I mean, think about it. We have a state whose motto is death to America, and we're trying to cut a deal with them, as we just proved the policy we tried with Russia didn't work. I mean, if it was the definition of insanity, we're looking at it right now. Guys, thanks for joining. I appreciate it. Coming up on Unfiltered, Lucas, supplies have to be a primary concern right now. And you know, to the north, even though they're having trouble, thankfully, the Russian invasion from the north, there's a client state up there, Belarus. It's not going to be a supply route there. So they really only have the west, Lucas. That's got to be a big concern for the Ukrainian government right now, keeping those supply lines open.
There's no question, and not just for food and medical supplies, but also weapons. Of course, the Americans, 14 European allies, have been flooding this country with weapons from all over, and not just, you know, of course, exactly, just from the West, from all over. We won't even get into specifics, Dan, but weapons are flooding here. Those anti-tank javelin missiles, those Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. In fact, we've seen a number of Ukrainian aircraft shot down today. There were reports that 5 Russian fighter jets were shot down today. And, of course, we saw a dramatic video of a Russian Hind-24 gunship shot down with what appeared to be an anti-aircraft missile, maybe a Stinger. Can't tell from the video, Dan.
Lucas, can't thank you enough for your excellent reporting. Thanks a lot. For years, the left has politicized phrases like Russian disinformation.
Within an hour or two of the Hollywood Access tape being made public, the Russian theft of John Podesta's emails hit WikiLeaks.
There used to be at least one thing you could count on in our politics. Republicans really didn't trust the Russians. But all that changed with the Trumpification of the GOP.
Does it surprise you at all that this information Rudy Giuliani is peddling very well could be connected to some sort of Russian government disinformation campaign?
If you promulgate that falsehood, you are doing the Kremlin's work against the United States of America.
Moscow's disinformation tactics haven't stopped.
They can't help themselves. And now, with Russia waging war in Ukraine, the fight over media censorship and Russian disinformation just took a whole new turn. Joining me now to discuss is research fellow at the Heritage Foundation and former Facebook employee, Kara Frederick. Kara, thanks for joining me. Listen, this Russian disinformation label, this can get ugly, as you well know. Does the war in Ukraine open the door for these political narratives, you know, for them to abuse that label and start attacking conservatives? Kara, we're seeing it already. We got a war in Ukraine going on, and there are leftists calling for more censorship of people here.
Exactly. And I think it absolutely opens the door. They're going to politicize everything they can. And remember, disinformation for the left means things that don't agree with our narrative, things that the Biden administration doesn't agree with. And for most Americans right now, this war is unfolding on our news feeds. This is our first real taste of the fog of war. Influence operations are flying. I'd say Ukraine has the edge right now. You look at Russia and Facebook going tit for tat. Russia's banned ads, restricted state media, and Russia's banned Facebook. And it all comes down to the fact that our ruling classes, and I would include big tech oligarchs in there too, along with the government and all the Democrats that you just showed, I would say our ruling classes, if they had not failed, to be honest brokers, then the implications of this war would be much more clear to Americans. But right now, we have no idea what to believe because we've been lied to about what disinformation and what real information really is for so long.
You know, Kara, the saddest part about this whole thing, I'm out to dinner with my wife tonight before I get on the air. And we're having a conversation, and she asked me about MasterCard. She's like, what do you think, MasterCard cutting off Putin and Russia and PayPal and other payment services? And I said, you know what? Ordinarily, I'd say, wow, that's really terrific, good. It'll put some pressure on them. But you know what seriously concerns me? That the left will see this as a bat signal to go in again and turn this on their political enemies here at home. And by the way, that's not a conspiracy theory. They've already done this kind of stuff. Stripe kicking Donald Trump off. That's got to go over to Heritage.
Precisely. I think this is a test run. Russia is a test run for what they can do to their domestic enemies here in the United States. We saw from the Department of Homeland Security on February 7th, they issued a threat advisory that said if Americans purvey disinformation, misinformation, malinformation over social media, that could potentially be considered terrorist activities. What have our neighbors to the north done? What has Trudeau done when it comes to pushing GoFundMe to not give the money to the truckers, that remaining $9 million? They've debanked, they've deplatformed the Freedom Convoy. I believe that this is fully a test run for what they can do to us here at home, and it is unsatisfactory.
It's weird. It's like, you know, we're emulating these autocrats' tactics. Well, last question. I got about 30 seconds left. But, you know, I read an interesting article in The Spectator by Stephen Miller talking about how this is the first social media war of our time, at least on this scale. You know, propaganda is everywhere, but the ability to see the war in live time outside of grainy images and night vision like we saw in the Iraq war, that changes the calculus here on both sides, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And especially when these tech companies are coming in and saying, you know, we're going to be arbiters of truth. I'm looking at this and I'm saying, okay, now do the Chinese Communist Party. You know, if you're going to virtue signal and you're going to not allow people to use your platforms, et cetera, and you're going to let Putin pile up the body bags and not have Trump on your platforms, they are building an airplane in mid-flight. They don't have a consistent framework, and it is not redounding to the benefit of the American people. I'm very worried about what's to come at the hands of big tech.
Such a good point. Such a good point. Kara, thanks for joining me. Really appreciate it. Coming up, President during wartime, retired Secret Service Deputy Assistant Director for the Office of Protective Operations, and a friend, Matt Quinn. Matt, thanks a lot for joining me tonight. I appreciate your time.
Dan, you bet. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so Matt, we worked together for a long time. We've both done advances in hostile hot zones, me in Afghanistan with President Obama, which was a war zone. It changes the protection calculus, doesn't it? And, you know, you and I had kind of chatted before the show, and you brought up a really great analogy to me, how it's similar to doing a disaster stop when a president travels to a tornado or a hurricane. If you could elaborate on that for the audience, I think they'd appreciate your expertise.
Yeah, sure. So, Dan, in the big picture, nothing really changes in terms of the environment. Or in terms of the mission when you're going out on these stops. You know, the three main things have to happen every time, no matter what. You've got to control access or limit access, limit exposure, and you've got to control the environment. And when you're dealing with something like you mentioned in a disaster stop, it is very similar to, I'm certain, what the Ukrainian security service is going through right now. And you don't have the luxury of conducting a full advance, of going out and spending really overtly out in the open public and with public awareness of conducting that advance to establish and meet those high-level mission requirements to create that secure environment and control everything. So disaster stops, as we call them often, would be a major, usually a natural occurring event, hurricane, tornado, and you always knew the president would be going right away. So knowing that you're not going to have that long-term ability to do a thorough advance, your biggest ally during that phase is secrecy. And conducting your advance in a short period of time, still trying to meet all of the criteria that's required to establish a safe environment, but do it with the absolute highest level of secrecy to ultimately protect and prevent those looking to do you harm the ability to know what your plans are.
So what you're getting at here, and it's a fascinating point. I didn't really think of the disaster stop analogy. I wish I would have. I'll footnote it if I mention it again, Matt. But the disaster stop, because we don't have the full portfolio of things available to us. If you bring a president to a tornado zone, surprise is your best asset. If we don't know, if the enemy doesn't know we're going, they can't plan. Zelensky's got that same problem now. He doesn't have time to send his advance team out to plan 3-4 days in advance because it could telegraph to a Russian invading army where he's going to be. So he's got to keep those protection elements, but maintaining the surprise. Is that what you're getting at? And also, if you could address one more thing, he's probably got some QRFs and some military stuff he's working with as well, outside of his regular protection unit, I would guess as well, right?
You would think so, Dan. Yes, back to the disaster stop trip. You're exactly right on that, and the being able to do it and have show up at a site unannounced, but still have the work done on the front end, albeit in a different format than you normally would, is critical. In terms of QRFs, I'm certain that the security services over there are pulling in the full complement of all available resources to support their efforts. Keeping in mind, they still have to be very, very careful about how much information is getting out there. Not only with when you bring in all of those forces and having the evacuation plans, your reload sites, your medical emergency response plans. Anytime they move, they're also going to be exposing themselves the more people that know about it. So secrecy, an insider threat is another big challenge that they're going to have over there.
That's yes, that is a big threat. And there have been some reporting that some Russian insiders have actually given up information about the hit teams, Matt. Unfortunately, I'm out of time. I could talk to you all day, but Matt, thanks for joining me. Really appreciate it.